Okay, so this is an example of the kind of presentation that you can do for the Anthropology 431 class, Fraudulent Archaeology. If you happen to stumble upon this video by chance, please note that everything that I'm going to talk about is pseudoscience, fraudulent, poor science, etc. This is an example of the kind of bad scholarship, well, it's not even scholarship, pseudo-archaeology that exists there. For my 431 students, this is the kind of presentation that you can do for your final project. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a little bit of insight into how I came up with this idea, just as an example, so you could kind of see the things that are possible. Okay, so this presentation is about archaeological evidence for Muslims discovering America before Columbus. This made the news a few years ago when the president of Turkey mentioned this in his speech, and then when he was criticized for it, doubled down, and he quoted some scholars, such as a Turkish scholar who said that at the time of Columbus, European maps were not very good. They would sailors like Columbus would have had to rely on Islamic maps, which were much better, and so that it's probable that Muslims actually reached the coast before Europeans reached the New World, North and Central and South America. Another scholar says that there's similarity between Native American and Arab place names, and he also quotes Columbus in a journal of Columbus, saying that when he was sailing a ship near Jibara on the northeast coast of Cuba, he saw a mosque on top of a beautiful mountain. So how did that mosque get there? Well, if we look at some of the history from right before Columbus, around the 1300s, one of the kings of the kingdom of Timbuktu and Mali in West Africa was Abu Bakr II, or Mansa Ku, as he's sometimes called. He abdicated the throne in 1311 to explore the limits of the ocean, according to the tradition. And he well, first I should mention that the Kingdom of Mali was a very impressive trading kingdom, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in during this, what we would call the medieval period. They traded gold and gold and salt across the Sahara Desert to North Africa and other places. Mansa Musa, who was a later king, was supposedly the richest ruler in history, or at least one of the richest rulers in history. According to some of the Muslim scholarship, they set out. There was a sort of only one ship made it back. He then built another ship, sailed westward on the Atlantic, and was never heard of again. So no one knows exactly what was discovered. But let's look at some of the similarity between the archaeological evidence and archaeological evidence from West Africa to show that there is indeed an influence from West Africa on early Native American remains from this time period. So if you compare cliff dwellings in West Africa and cliff dwellings in Southwest United States, this is Mesa Verde, which is in Colorado. It's an Anasazi dwelling from the 12th century AD. This is a more recent cliff dwelling from West Africa, and you could see the obvious similarities. Here's another one from Mali, you can see, from the Dogon region, and here's another view of that mesa in the United States, right? And so it seems, when you look at this, it seems pretty clear that they were built by the same group of people. You also see large towers in Mesa Verde, and these are obviously minarets, right? So these are obviously mosques that are being built in the Southwest by these people who probably are descended from the West Africans who came across on ship to the New World. You can also see mosque towers in a place like Hovenweep. When you look more closely at the masonry, here's in West Africa, this is in Ghana, you can see the same style of masonry in Chaco Canyon, which is in New Mexico, another Anasazi site. So there's no way that two different people could come up with this style on their own. So obviously there had to be a connection. You can also see striking similarities between the Djenné Mosque and some of the other mosques in West Africa and some of the ruins in the southwest. They're made out of the same kind of material like adobe and plastered over. You can see this is probably a very large mosque. When it was first found by Spanish explorers, I believe it was called Casa Grande, or Big House, but obviously a mosque. You can also see that in the symbolism. So Moundville, you have a couple of artifacts that bear a hand with what looks like an eye in the palm, which is a very common motif you still see today throughout the Middle East. It's supposed to protect from the evil eye. It's sometimes called the Hamza or hand of Fatma. So again, a very close connection between these groups, showing that the people at that time in North America came from West African explorers. What is sometimes called Serpent Mound is actually misidentified as a serpent. It's actually probably, according to my theory, supposed to spell out the name of Allah or God, right? So you could see that swirl here, that swirl here. This is probably indicating this line, right? So probably the name of Allah in a very, very large mound. We'll see some other Muslim influence in some other ruins. If we go further west again, in Utah, you have Arches National Park, where you can find these enormous walls that were carved from the bedrock. And you can see the line here that shows human carving and chiseling on here to produce these nice, thin, very, very steep walls. Arches are very important in Islamic architecture, and so here in this area of Utah, you have a number of these arches that clearly show, you can see carving, so you can see the banding as they tried to carve this down into an arch from the solid material. This was probably part of a structure, maybe some sort of mosque. This area probably had several mosques with these arches. Right, here's another one. You can see, very finely carved. This one, you can see the walls, and you can clearly see the remains of the working by people. It starts north, but then this wall points to the east, and of course it's pointing to Mecca, which is where people would face when they pray, when Muslims pray. So you can see here they oriented it deliberately towards Mecca. Here you can see some of these other large walls that were carved by the people. This particular one, the double arch, the back arch also, you can see here, faces east, right? So here's north, right? It's facing towards the east, again towards Mecca. And on the winter solstice, you can actually see the moon appear within that arch, forming what looks like an eye, probably to reflect that Hamza symbol again. So they deliberately are modifying the landscape to create these arches as part of very, very large buildings that were most likely used as mosques. Another arch there, ribbon arch, you can see is oriented to the east, right? So here's the arch right over here, and you can see facing pretty much towards east. There's also a monument which is carved to look like three, to represent three different things, and most likely it's representing the three holy sites of Islam: Jerusalem, Medina, and Mecca. Right? These are some of the sources I used for the presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, so That was complete rubbish. Uh, but it shows you one of the things you can do for your presentation. So, how did I come about with this presentation? Well, this is a very difficult assignment. I will admit that freely. It's hard to necessarily think of something that hasn't been thought before. And, you've been taught to think like scientists and think rationally for 4 years. And I'm asking you to do completely the opposite, to put yourself in the minds of people who do this kind of fraudulent work, and to try and expand on it and think of something new that maybe hasn't been done. So that's very, very difficult. But I was trying to think of different ideas, and, some of the things, some of the methods were occurring to me, such as, taking geological formations, interpreting them as human-made, looking at, let's say, structures and archaeological sites and finding constellation orientations on them, looking at connections between cultures and cherry-picking just minor similarities, ignoring everything else about the culture to draw a connection between two different cultures and two different areas. Those were some of the methods I was thinking about. And so then I was thinking, we talked about the Vikings in North America, we talked about the Celts in North America, what's another group I could think of? And so I was thinking, what about Muslims? So then I Googled Muslims in pre-Columbus, Muslims America, that kind of thing. And I found that article about the Turkish president. I did a little bit more research, and I found some of the historical bases that they try to use, right? That is, a couple of citations in books, a couple of accounts. Mostly people who use the archaeological evidence look at the Olmec heads like we've talked about before and say, look, the Olmec heads look African. They're most likely depicting Africans. Africans probably came from West Africa during this time period. That's the most likely time period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was trying to think, so what else can I add to it besides the Olmec heads? So I was saying, let me look at some Native American sites. So I tried different things. I looked at North American sites and tried to see if there's anything I could do in terms of positioning. I was trying to look at Islamic astronomy and constellations. That didn't really lead anywhere. And then I thought, what about architecture and sites? And so I got the idea, which is kind of a little, obviously a big stretch between Serpent Mound and Allah, but I thought, so if I was going to misinterpret things and pick out certain things and say, these are Muslim characteristics, it would be, an eastward-facing buildings, use of an arch, things like that. So I decided to use some of the archaeology of the Southwest, because, and there were some people already, so that wasn't original to me, the comparison of cliff dwellings. So that one I took and then expanded on. So what was new was the masonry comparison, the Hamza symbol comparison, which you saw that evil eye, and then the misinterpretation of Arches National Park. I should also point out that Columbus quote is a complete misappropriation of the actual quote. It's in the actual book that it comes from. Christopher Columbus reports seeing a mountain like a mosque along the coast of Cuba. He never said he saw a mosque, but someone took that completely out of context and changed it to Columbus saw a mosque or a minaret, on the coast of Cuba. I don't think I looked for Arches National Park and looked if somebody has interpreted it as human created. I don't think so because I think it's kind of so ingrained that it's a geologic structure. But I would not be surprised if someone does something similar to what I did, maybe in the near future. But if you look at the geology of the area, I mean, you can clearly see the bedding, the sedimentary rocks, the layers, the uplift, right? So this is clearly natural. But if you pick out a few examples, and because those arches are so distinct, you pick out a few examples, you can make it look like it's human created. So hopefully that just gives you some ideas. So try and figure something that you can do. Try and put maybe some references at the end for the websites that you cited. See if you can build some sort of argument using the kind of illogic that people use, the cherry picking of data, the sort of spurious similarities that they try to look for, taking things out of context, ignoring all the other evidence and just picking out a few things that support your idea. See if you could come up with something, and hopefully that will, the experience will teach you a little bit more about how some of these kind of fraudulent ideas work. So thanks, and I look forward to seeing your presentations.